You have to see a few of these clips from Steve Bannon's appearance on the new Gavin Newsom podcast. We talked about the podcast last week and why I think, maybe counter to some people on the right, it's actually a pretty good idea from Gavin Newsom. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a second. But first, let's take a look at this clip. I think this is maybe the most powerful moment in Bannon's appearance on the Newsom podcast. Obviously, he's had Charlie Kirk and Michael Savage on, the California governor, that is, just in the last couple of weeks or last week. But Bannon addressed, or actually kind of interrupted, Newsom to address Newsom's claim of Trump's, quote, grievance politics. I don't want to spoil this clip. I want you to watch it. Take a look.
What do you mean for Trump?
I think there's sort of the grievance narrative that comes from Trump. This notion there is sort of a victim grievance.
Well, they did try to put him in prison for 300 years.
Now, Newsom also played the role of almost a journalist, where he was expressing genuine curiosity. It was sort of like a Theo Von style conversation with Bannon. He expressed some really genuine curiosity about how Bannon defined populism, and Bannon gave a pretty good answer. Let's take a listen.
The political class, the Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, all of it have really forgotten the underlying kind of principles of the country and kind of left working class people, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, sexual preference, you pick it.
I also have to play this clip of Adam Kinzinger, former Republican congressman turned Never Trump MSNBC pundit, who freaked out in reaction to the news before he even saw the podcast, as far as I can tell, the news that Bannon would be appearing on Newsom's podcast. That was enough to set him off. Let's take a look.
I woke up this morning fully expecting the outrage of the day to be something that Trump did, or the fact that Jared Golden, a Democrat, voted for the continuing resolution last night, which is also insane. And then I see this. I see that Gavin Newsom has decided to invite Steve Bannon on his podcast, and they're going to have just a wonderful conversation. Last week, he had Charlie Kirk on his podcast. That I didn't get extremely outraged about, even though Kirk is one of the bad guys. Bannon is the author of this chaos we're seeing right now. Bannon is the one that says you need to flood the zone with shit. Bannon is the one that has basically authored where we are and what Donald Trump wants. And because Gavin Newsom wants to run for president and thinks he's going to be this healer, he brings on this nationalist. Many of us on the right sacrificed our careers taking these people on, and Newsom's trying to make a career with them. This is insane.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, as they say, but I want to start just with this question of who benefits from this kind of, what would we call it, crossover, the most ambitious crossover of all time. This was, I thought, a really smart tweet from Daniel Edward Rosen, who pointed out that back in 2018, The New Yorker actually canceled an interview that was scheduled between Steve Bannon and David Remnick. I think it was actually at the New Yorker festival, and that all went up in flames. And Rosen points out, quote, "It was a move that even Lawrence Wright criticized, saying journalism is about hearing opposing views." But in 2018, you actually really could not make that case to a lot of other journalists. Bannon was simply too toxic. And Bannon has not changed. The ideology of Steve Bannon is the same right now as it was in 2018. If anything, to the extent that you could measure it on a spectrum, people could argue plausibly that Bannon has dug his heels in even harder since the lawfare and the assassination attempts on Donald Trump. So it's quite interesting that what's really changing here fundamentally is not Bannon, but it is the permission structure that exists for people on the left to quote unquote platform people like Steve Bannon. And this brings us to the question of who's benefiting. I think Newsom is benefiting. And actually, in an interesting way, Peachy Keenan agrees. I wanted to put this tweet from Peachy Keenan on your radar as well. In response to news that Bannon would be appearing on the podcast, which, by the way, hilariously is called This Is Gavin Newsom, Peachy Keenan says, "The only way to win this game is not to play. The temptation to own Newsom is incredibly tempting, but he cannot be owned in this format. He is attempting to prove to the country that he can, quote, understand both sides and listen to MAGA and position himself as a bipartisan, reasonable centrist who is not an extremist or polarizing like his 2028 opponent, JD. It's a trap because if you say no, he can say you were scared. Impossible for me me to even imagine him ever being popular nationwide, but we live in a black swan world. Why hasn't Newsom become electoral kryptonite yet? How do we dislodge this worm? Peachy is a Californian, so has clearly a very visceral response to the Newsom rehabilitation campaign that's going on right now. Obviously, his image has been, at least on the national scale, really tainted by all of the problems that California has faced. And California is a deep blue state, so obviously he has a built-in advantage with California voters, although his popularity there is tough too. I mean, he has to overcome questions about homelessness, drug abuse, wildfires. It's not an easy time to be the governor of California, though, for reasons that certainly were within Gavin Newsom's control. So whether he can escape the blame nationally for all of that is, I think, legitimately a really good question. But what's interesting to me about Peachy's point here is she's actually saying this is good for Gavin Newsom, whereas a lot of people, and I think myself included, are saying this is good for Steve Bannon. But perhaps it's good for both of them. Can that be true at the same time? I don't know. It's an interesting question, right? Because from Newsom's perspective, he gets to look like he is genuinely curious. He gets to present himself as someone who's not afraid of new ideas, and even someone who's willing to concede that maybe he was wrong, as he did in the Kirk interview, and actually, willing to get owned by Steve Bannon on his own show, like he did when he claimed that Trump's grievance politics, or started to claim that Trump was running a kind of grievance politics operation, and Bannon interjected and really body slammed him in that particular exchange. On the other hand, he gets to have clips like that exchange on populism from Bannon's perspective, where he lets Steve Bannon finish an answer, doesn't do the sort of breathless pundit thing where he's constantly interrupting. He did a debate actually on Fox News, Sean Hannity moderated it, you may remember, with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, because both of them were respectively trying to make their case that Democrats and Republicans are leading both of their states in a better direction. Way harder case for Newsom to make, let alone on Fox News, but Newsom really played the role of a smarmy politician, where he had that plastic grin on his face and was hardly the pundit version, hardly the podcast version of Newsom that we are seeing now. And I think, again, this really speaks to the shifting permission structure that Newsom, to Peachy's point, realizes this format allows him to show he can, quote, understand both sides and, quote, listen to MAGA, and that he's not, quote, polarizing like a potential opponent in 2028. I think it's pretty clear that Gavin Newsom's ambitions are national and presidential at this point. So what he's trying to do is take advantage of the fact that Democrats don't get canceled by their own tribe for, quote unquote, platforming people like Steve Bannon anymore. Adam Kinzinger is going to be hysterical over it. He's going to cry and whine. But for the most part, Newsom is not going to have to resign because he talked to Steve Bannon on his podcast and smiled and laughed and joked with Charlie Kirk. But that actually was the case several years ago. And it wasn't the case because the public wanted to cancel people who platformed Steve Bannon. It was the case that elites were very much taking that tiny sliver of people who created a ruckus on social media and treating them as representative of the broader population, because they were all on Twitter, they were all on social media, and they said, oh my gosh, the public is upset that we are, platforming Steve Bannon. My peers, in the case of David Remnick and the New Yorker, are saying this is unacceptable. I must cave, even if this is standard journalistic practice. So what's happened is that elites have realized the public doesn't care. In fact, the public actually wants people to engage with their fiercest ideological opponents. The public right now is completely open to that. There are, of course, still some people, especially in elite circles, Adam Kinzinger among them, who don't want to see that. But it really is good for Gavin Newsom to look like he's mixing it up. Because from his perspective, and we talked about this on last week's show, he also gets clips that he's able to post that are totally within his control on social media, like when he thought he owned Charlie Kirk on the issue of so-called book bans, which I personally don't think he owned Charlie Kirk on at all, but you can see Newsom actually selected, out of his exchanges with Charlie Kirk, that bit to post on his own social media. Why? Because it's sort of like red meat to the Dem base, to people who might vote for Gavin Newsom in a primary. They get to see him, apparently, dunking on Charlie Kirk on a red meat culture war issue that they care about, and that makes Gavin Newsom look good to them. So it gives Newsom some measure of control over his messaging. And in a way, that's kind of helping Democrats usher in this new era. The New York Times had a story about how Democrats like Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania are increasingly turning to sports shows to rehabilitate their brand after Trump won in November. And, even in the state of Pennsylvania, David McCormick won in November. They're envious, and rightfully so, of people like Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan, and, influencers' abilities to get these Republicans on their show and have an open conversation with them. And so the question is, do Democrats have enough like J.D. Vance types who are able to sit through a 3-hour interview on Rogan and actually come across as likable, casual, someone you'd have a beer with? Can Gavin Newsom pull that off? That is yet to be determined. I think Peachy Keenan thinks, yes, that he can. But this really speaks to the cost-benefit analysis. Democrats don't have in their farm team a lot of J.D. Vances because they're overly responsive to elites. They're overly responsive to the people that are clustered in newsrooms, classrooms, and boardrooms. And they have been for a couple of decades at this point. So they never built up this farm team of people who can speak off the cuff really, really well, who are in the sort of backbench, ready to bring to the forefront of politics. That's why Joe Biden kind of won in 2020, because he was one of the only Democrats who could appear like a normal human being and wasn't, as Elizabeth Warren did, talking about Latinx people in the first presidential debate, which, it's just such a good example of how overly responsive Democrats are to the classroom and the newsroom, where, publications started using that term. And it turned out a lot of Hispanics, when polling was done, didn't like it. So do Democrats have a farm team that can succeed in this medium? Can Gavin Newsom himself succeed in this medium? I think the jury is honestly out on that right now, because if Newsom keeps getting owned on his own podcast by Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk, and that can't be outweighed by what he thinks of him owning those guys, which I'm sure he'll get plenty of clips where he can post them and rile up Democratic voters. Maybe he can. He desperately needs to seem more buttoned down, as we were talking about earlier in his debate with Ron DeSantis, and just generally. He really, you always see Gavin Newsom going where the wind blows. He constantly has his finger in the air, looking for the direction of the wind. And so when it was cool to be woke, Gavin Newsom was woke. When it's cool to be buttoned down, bro podcasting, he's doing buttoned down, bro podcasting. It's just who Gavin Newsom is. And so now he knows it behooves him, or it will behoove him politically, to seem casual, off the cuff, and ready to just yuck it up with his fiercest ideological opponents, that he can go toe-to-toe with the right but still respect them. He's a chameleon, and as many politicians are. I've never thought that he was a particularly good chameleon so much as he's a particularly smart one. He's good at knowing where the wind is blowing, and he's so shameless that he's actually willing to move in that direction, which a lot of Democrats so far aren't. Kamala Harris wasn't really eager to open up on Call Her Daddy or Howard Stern. Those were pretty robotic experiences for Kamala Harris, or appearances for Kamala Harris. So if Gavin Newsom can do it, that jury is out. Whether other Democrats can do it, that jury is out. But this could be, I think it's true, this could be really powerful for Newsom. And maybe that just speaks to how low the bar is, given how chameleonic Newsom is. Maybe it speaks to how low the bar is. I don't think Alyssa Slotkin, who Democrats had give the response to Trump's joint address and just trotted out on The View, where she had an awful quote about how America is like an angry teenager right now, which will absolutely be interpreted in Michigan as her saying Trump voters are angry teenagers whose, quote, brains are not fully formed, which is another thing she said about America being a, quote, young country. Do they have anyone can actually do? Trump is a singular figure, but do they have anyone who can do what J.D. Vance even did? Do they have anyone who can step into that role? Marco Rubio went toe-to-toe with Megyn Kelly, who's obviously pretty sympathetic to Marco Rubio and endorsed Donald Trump, but he had a long and really interesting conversation with her on her show. who's doing that among potential Democratic nominees? I don't know. This is a significant problem for them. So we'll be back here with more Undercurrents soon. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for premium episodes of the show, a weekly email, a special way to reach us, and more awesome features from Unheard. Thanks for watching.